Hello, I'm Bob Wilhelm, and I'm a storyteller. This is the first in a series of online seminars available 24/7. No need to register. View it whenever you wish. And I don't know how long it's going to be. I'll try to keep the sessions relatively short, and I'll number them. And maybe there'll be a half a dozen, maybe there'll be 100. I don't know. But what I'd like to share with you is my experience as a storyteller. This has been my life's work. A little bit about my background. I was born in New York City and during the Second World War, 1943, Christmas time. My parents were immigrants. My father from Hungary, my mother from what was then Czechoslovakia. And I was the first one in our family born in America. So I grew up in a very urban setting, a very Catholic setting, and a very Eastern European setting. My neighbors were Russians and Jews and Gypsies and Slovaks and Croatians and Hungarians and Austrians. It was in Manhattan in an area called Yorkville on the east side. So I learned my stories really from initially from my grandmother, who told them in Hungarian when I was just a little kid, 2 and 3, maybe 4 years old. So I only have a smattering of Hungarian, but I understood enough then to understand her very simple stories meant for little children. But my main storyteller was my mother, who was from Czechoslovakia. And she told stories endlessly. She grew up in a very traditional family in a small town and had endless stories from her environment, Eastern Europe. And I would listen to her all the time. I'd come home from school. She'd have a snack ready for me as I walked home from school a couple of blocks away, came in, and she'd be cooking dinner and she would tell me stories about her growing up, about life in her village of Malatsky. And I grew up on that, nurtured by her imagination and her very traditional approach to storytelling. My father was not a storyteller, but he was a great reader and loved history, had a very nice library, which I read as a little child. Stories of places and histories of India and China, and he had his his love was for the whole world and all the stories that were in it. So between the literary background of my father, an avid reader, and my mother, who was not a reader but a teller, a listener and a teller, my storytelling grew as some sort of a mix, or I like to say a balance between literary sources and oral sources, and it's always been that way for me. I really became a storyteller when I was 19 years old. Until then, I loved reading fictional stories. I'd go to the library. I especially listened to older people. I would love to have older people at some event, a family event or some church event or school event. And while most kids would run off to play with other kids, I really soaked in what I heard from the elders. The elders were always incredibly important to me, and I'm still that way. I'm an elder now too, and there aren't that many people who are a lot older than me. But that really shaped my story listening and my storytelling. First, the listening. But when I was 19, I finished um, my second year in college. I was very bored studying history, but I wasn't interested in the classes. It was the beginning of turmoil in the early 1960s, the very beginning of involvement in Vietnam. These things were just slowly unfolding. I was at a Catholic uh, commuter college in New Jersey, Seton Hall University, but I had to leave. I had to leave because the word was meaningless. I felt it was meaningless to be a student and to take tests and to read assigned books and to worry about marks and to think about a career. I hated all of that. So what did I do? Others, I think, from my age, who went dropped into Greenwich Village and became latter-day beatniks or early hippies, but I didn't do that. I went to Indiana and I taught elementary school in a very rural community, St. Joseph's Catholic School, Decatur, Indiana. And I had a double class, fifth graders facing one wall and one blackboard, sixth graders facing the other wall. And all day long, I would go back and forth, teaching a lesson to one group and then the other group, back and forth. Uh, I was eager, I was conscientious, but I was also quite naive. And I really felt that despite my love for stories, that this wasn't the place to do stories. I somehow thought I had to teach these kids the basics, and storytelling wasn't one of the basics. That was for fun, that wasn't for learning. So, reading, writing, arithmetic, I prepared my lessons carefully and I went over them every morning. I'd get to school an hour before the kids arrived and I'd go over all of my lessons for a number of weeks in the fall as I began teaching my fifth and sixth graders. And then one morning, the first child to come in, he was a fifth grader, just a short little boy, a little chubby, very diligent, very attentive, very smart. His name was Timmy Baker. And Timmy came in holding a huge book. I mean, he was a little guy, and it was a huge reference book. Well, it was the Arbuthnot Anthology. And the Arbuthnot Anthology was a source book for stories to be used in libraries and in the classroom. It was usually a reference book in a library, but for some reason he was able to check it out from the local public library and bring it to class that morning. And he came in and he came right up and he plopped it right on my desk. And he said, this is Indiana, so those first words will be unique to Indiana. How's come, Mr. Wilhelm? You never tell us any stories. Well, I was surprised. I didn't think that's why I was there. But he was so disappointed that I'd never told any stories for the 6 or 7 weeks that I'd already been teaching that year. And he checked the book out of the library and gave it to me. I took the book home, and that night I read some of the stories. I did the same for a number of nights, going through the book, reading a number of stories from here and there, and I even checked it out in my own name. I don't know how I did that, but I remember that he had to return it to the library, and so I took it back to the library and I used my library card, and I somehow talked the librarian into letting me pretty much have it for the entire year since I was teaching fifth and sixth graders. And after a short while, I began to read a story at the end of every school day. And just a story that I picked from the anthology. And it went on. I read story after story after story. And then I began, as the year went on and we got into the new year and in late winter and into spring, I began to read other stories. I don't think I ever told a story without the written text, but I would read them carefully, and then I would do it as the treat to end the day before the kids went out and go back home or out to play in the afternoon. And at the end of the year, I decided I was going to tell a story without any notes, without the book, and I knew which one it was because I had discovered that not far from us, Decatur, northeast Indiana, not far from us in Fort Wayne, I don't know, maybe 20 miles away, there was a cemetery, and in that cemetery was buried a man named John Chapman. And John Chapman was actually Johnny Appleseed, the real historic Johnny Appleseed. So I arranged for an outing. It's one of the last days of school. I don't know how I did it. We didn't have a bus. I think a number of parents had their cars, and a good part of the class went. And we went to this rather decrepit cemetery at that time. It was on a little hillock, and not much of a hill because it's all flat country in that part of the world. And it overlooked a very dismal shopping center, one of those, 1950s was the beginning of shopping centers, and I guess it was fairly new as a shopping center, but it looked so dismal, big paved lot and boxy buildings, strip mall. And we gathered around the grave. I'd not seen the grave before, I just knew it was there. And it said John Chapman. And we gathered around the grave, and I told the story of Johnny Appleseed, who he was, how he traveled from place to place, how he collected apple seeds, and how he spread them, and how, in a sense, the great settlement of the old Northwest, Ohio and Indiana and other places, but especially those two places, were shaped by his giving apple seeds to farmers when he stayed overnight. He was a drifter, he wandered about, he was a peddler. But he also did something else that really struck me. He always carried a Bible with him, and he would tear out a single page from the Bible and leave it with the apple seeds. Now, I thought about that a lot back then, and there was some sense that I had that there was a connection between something sacred and something very ordinary. Something about stories and seeds and fruit and nourishment and blessings that were all somehow tied together. So that's how I became a storyteller.